I've had some moments teaching that I'm not super proud of, and one moment in particular happened my second year teaching. It was the end of the school year, think June, everybody's feeling done. It was hot in the classroom, dismissal, and I was hanging by the teeny tiniest of threads. And then naturally during dismissal at the end of the day, two of my students start actually physically fighting over a wheelie chair, and I was like, come on guys, why are we fighting over a wheelie chair right now? Get up and let's stop this. And I went over to them to go break this altercation up. And I'll never forget what one of my students said. He looked me dead in the eye and said, Miss, when are you going to understand that nobody likes you? And my second year teacher self was so taken aback by that. I did have a response, and now looking back on it, it probably wasn't the best response I could have had. But I looked him back in the eye and I said, I do not need you to like me. I need you to respect me. Get up off this chair. And he got up off the chair, and it was rough. It was a rough ending to the day. And truthfully, it was not the best relationship I had with that student all year long. And I don't think I really helped matters as much as I could have, being the adult in the room. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because I never really thought about why that moment bothered me so much until recently. And quite truthfully, I feel like I never really thought about why different things do bother me in the classroom that students do, whereas others don't. And I don't think I'm alone with that. So that's why I wanted to have an episode today talking about teacher self-awareness, because I feel like it's the missing ingredient in classroom management that nobody's really talking about. So we're going to change that today. So first things first, why are students' behavior so triggering in the first place? And I honestly think it's because we are all people as teachers, and we come into the classroom with our own life experiences and our own personal triggers. And sometimes students do things that just awaken those knee-jerk reactions within us. And it doesn't always make sense either. So for example, for me, I've found that I feel incredibly triggered if a student's ignoring me. However, I do not feel very triggered even if a student is grabbing a chair and getting ready to throw it. And it makes no sense. Like, there's no real rationale between those two things, but that's how it works in my brain. And I don't think I'm alone in this either. And outside of our own lived experiences that can result in these triggers within us, I think just the act of teaching in general can be really harmful sometimes, and it can leave lasting impacts on you. And it can also create triggers. So for example, my fourth year teaching, I had this terrible experience. It was the end of a week, and I was outside doing recess duty, and I was teaching in a very rural school at the time. So there was a fence along some parts of the playground. However, there was no fence around this whole entire forest section. And then through that forest, it was just woods for miles. And so I'm on the track, I'm watching the kids play, and then one of my students looks at me and says, hey, Mrs. Hartsey, isn't that Blink going into the woods right now? And I was like, what are you talking about? And I look over, and sure enough, I see one of my students start booking it into the forest. And so immediately I take off after him. I have my walkie-talkie, I have my ballet flats on, my pea coat, and I just start booking it for the forest. And he's running through the forest, and I am chasing after him, all the while saying, hey, stop, turn around, you don't need to do this, stop, we're here for you. While also communicating on my walkie-talkie that, hey, I need backup, I am in the forest right now trying to stop this student who's running away. And we ran probably for like half a mile through the forest, but eventually I got him to stop. And then support from the school came into the forest too. We left the forest, he got the help he needed, and then I went back into my classroom and I had to teach. We were doing debates that day, I still remember, but I went back into my classroom and I was shaking. My feet were bleeding. It was so stressful, like honestly dramatic even. And then eventually the office sent somebody up to watch the class so I could go to the nurse and like tend to my wounds and just cry in a bed for a little while. But it was so impactful for me that now, even if a student is in my classroom and they leave the doorway and go into the hallway, I find my heart rate racing. It's insane. It happens so quickly. And I realized this last year when I had a student who was waiting to do an after-school sport, leave our building, go to the corner store to buy a candy bar or whatever before his sport started. And when I couldn't find him in those 5 minutes, I started freaking out. And when he came back in, I was near tears. I was so panicked looking for him. And he was like, oh, I just went to the corner store. And I didn't realize at the time why I had such an emotional reaction to that, but now I do. And I think it's because because of my own lived experiences as a teacher, but also as a person. And I think it's super important for us to be aware of these things because it's going to impact how we handle different situations. So that's one thing to say, right? But how are you actually supposed to be self-aware when you're a teacher? And there are a few things I've started doing in recent years that have helped me, and I'm not an expert in this by any means, but I want to share them in case they'd be helpful for you. So the first thing I try to do is really step back and just read the room and see where my students are, where they're coming from, what might be bothering them, and I reset myself. The way I reset myself can look different depending on the situation, what the students are doing, and what I feel like I need at the moment, but I have legit shut the entire class down. I've stopped my lesson mid-lesson, turned off the lights, and had everybody just sit at their desks silently, read a book, draw, work on unfinished work, whatever, but do something where you do not need to talk to me for 2 minutes. And during that time, I will sit at the front of the room or at my desk, and I will just practice regulatory breathing. And I do this on display too, and sometimes I'll even tell the kids, this is what I'm doing right now, so they can see the skills I tell them that they should be doing being modeled to them. And what I've also been trying to do lately too is when I find myself getting all hyped up and feeling, that stress response you feel in the body when things are starting to go a little sour in the classroom, when I start feeling that, I start asking myself, does my reaction or does my emotion match the situation? Or might I be overreacting to this? In doing that and asking myself that helps put things in perspective. And then another thing that's been really helpful for me is thinking about where my students are coming from. So, for example, if the class keeps talking and I'm asking them to stop talking and they continue doing it, rather than taking the perspective, these students won't listen to me, I try taking the perspective, okay, why do these students need to talk so badly right now? And I'll ask them, I'm like, hey, what's going on? Why are we so chatty today? And they might say something like, oh, we had a big test in the other class, or we lost our recess today, so we were all frustrated earlier. But whatever the situation is, it's important to read the room and then be able to help the students meet their own need in a better way. So what I'll tell my students is, if you feel like you need to talk and you need a 2-minute break, I need you to ask me for a 2-minute break. Rather than have a side conversation with somebody and have me need to keep stopping the lesson, let me just stop for everybody, take a few minutes, do what you need to do, and then we'll come back to the lesson. It's not a big deal. And I think they're so taken aback by the fact that I welcome that in the classroom that it takes them a few months to get into the habit of asking for a break and asking for things like that. But I really want to equip my students with the tool of self-advocacy, because being able to identify your need and advocate for what you need to help meet that need, super important. And doing all of these things helps me remain so much calmer in the classroom, because rather than being in this fight or flight mode when student behavior issues arise, I find myself more like in a spectator seat, watching them, making sure I'm keeping myself under control, and then picking a solution to help manage the problem. And it's so much less stressful to be in that position as an educator. We have a million things to do anyways, and being able to reduce stress in that area, it's been life-changing. So now I'm curious to hear from you. What are your thoughts on teacher self-awareness? Am I reading too much into this, or do you feel like it's a very useful strategy for us to have? And if so, how do you manage yourself in the classroom? I truly feel like this is the most undertaught part of our program. Comment down below what your thoughts are. And if you're watching on YouTube, you probably noticed that my mouth is no longer matching my words. That's because my microphone cut out for the last bit of the video. But anyways, thank you for being here, and as always, you've got this.